Well, it's an absolute delight and pleasure to be here. The Centre for European Reform is one of these funny organisations that is seen as a kind of swivelised federalist organisation in London and horribly Eurosceptic in Brussels. As a result of that, I'm going to follow that kind of feeling, and I'm going to be a bit more glass half empty than our previous speakers, although not horribly Eeyore-ish. The other thing about the CER is that it's a pro-EU organisation, one which sees itself as a critical friend of the EU, but which sprang out of a country which is leaving the EU. So we've had a pretty awful few years, to be honest, although it's been one of those things where it's emotionally draining and upsetting, but where business has never really been any better for the think tank as a whole, as you can imagine. So what I basically want to do is just talk about three issues, really. One is the euro, one is the migration crisis, and one is Brexit. And we've had a wonderful sort of tour d'horizon, to be slightly pretentious, from our two speakers already. But I just want to drill down a bit into those two issues and think about how they differ and why two of them have created massive amounts of disunity in the EU, whereas one of them has created massive amounts of unity, and maybe then think a bit about the future and what that kind of tells us. So if we start with where the EU is right now, I mean, it looks pretty divided. France and Germany relations are pretty bad. They can be quite openly dismissive at times of each other. Macron's big ideas for reforming the Eurozone, Germany has said no, or they've tried to water a lot of his proposals down. For its part, France is saying, well, you know, Merkel's on her way out and we don't have a proper partner because she hasn't got the strength to be able to drive through the reforms that Macron wants through the German political system. So that's not great. The tandem that generally drives EU integration is not going brilliantly. Then you've got Italy and France having lots of spats about various issues. Macron sees himself as the sort of the pro-EU reformer who's, Jupiterian figure who's going to really make the EU work, be an integrative force within the EU. You have Salvini, who sees himself as the person that's going to return powers to the nation state. And that there's been a flashpoint about migration issues and various other things between them. And then we've also got East-West, East Commission splits. We've already mentioned Hungary and Poland. That's something which is very troubling because you have, while you have, very strong, they're both pro-EU governments, they both want to remain in the EU, there's an undermining of the norms of liberal democracy and the rule of law, which is going on with countries who are already in. Generally, during the enlargement process, when countries want to join the EU, there's attempts to try and get rid of any illiberalism through that process and say, look, you can have the access to the market, you can have all the benefits that EU membership brings, but you've got to be a liberal democracy. It's much harder to do that when a country is already inside. The mechanisms that we have are much weaker. So that's the kind of context. And let's just have a little bit of a think about the euro and why it's caused so many divisions up until now. And I realise I'm saying this as a Brit who's outside the EU, but I hope that my analysis is not going to be the bog standard British Euroscepticism. And I want to start by conjuring a thought that Kevin O'Rourke, the Oxford historian, who I don't know if he's ever spoken here, but if not, you should get him. He made this very good point about the euro, which I think is going to sort of colour the rest of what I say, which is that the big difference between the euro crisis and previous crises that the EU has had is, one, that it's systemic, and two, that in a lot of ways it's fundamentally zero-sum. One country wins, the other country loses. And this is what happens when you have big imbalances of creditors and debtors, with creditors generally based in one country and debtors based in the other. You have a debt crisis, someone has to pay. It's either the creditors or the debtors. And obviously that was strongest in Greece. but it's something which, you know, in terms of the Irish banking system, then we've obviously had some issues there. And it's something which may ultimately happen in Italy. I genuinely hope that it doesn't. We haven't papered over the cracks exactly. There's been some really big, important reforms which have been done. The European Central Bank is now acting a bit more like the Bank of England or the Federal Reserve. It's much less Germanic. It's not saying we must, you know, we're fine with very low inflation. We must ensure that we have sound money. All of that kind of stuff is going out of the window, and it's becoming much more like I would say, an orthodox central bank after the financial crisis, which is good news. And Draghi's promise to do whatever it takes, i.e. lend money to governments that get into trouble, that has been the number one thing which has ended the euro crisis. And we have to remember that that was done, while Merkel ultimately was in favour of it, it was done with a lot of German opposition. As I said, Italy is still a pretty large concern. It's a bit too big to save, given the money that the Eurozone has at the moment. Its economy is stagnant. It's doing a bit better in terms of its banking system. It's doing a bit better in terms of unemployment, but that's a country which is going to be very difficult to resolve. And when it comes to the next recession, it's not totally clear how Italy is going to be able to cope, particularly if it's a particularly severe recession in Italy. So that's one question. But the really big ideas, returning to the ideas that Macron had for reform, they had the elements of a transfer union within them. The idea was to have a budget, which would mean that when a country got into trouble, some money would flow in. That would help it to cope with the economic shock that hit it. But a transfer union, returning to Kevin O'Rourke's idea of zero sum, for a lot of people in the north, they feared that this would just mean that money would just continually flow one way. And how we get over that divide within the Eurozone is a really big issue. And I fear that it's only going to happen under the most amount of duress at the time of maximum crisis, simply because it's going to take a politician of enormous skill and facing some really huge risks to be able to drive German public opinion towards something which looks a bit more like a kind of pan-Eurozone fiscal system. Thinking about the migration crisis, this is also a zero-sum crisis. This is also one country wins, the other country loses. Migrants coming across the Mediterranean, very dangerous crossing in the central Mediterranean from Libya to Italy, and from Greece, from Turkey to Greece. Those are the two frontline states. And in order to be able to help them deal with that, the optimum way of doing that would be for asylum seekers and migrants to be distributed around the EU as a whole in order for the burden to be shared. But that's not what happened. The vast majority were left in Italy and Greece. There wasn't much solidarity shown. And that's one of the big reasons why we have ended up with Salvini essentially running the Italian government and leading in all of the opinion polls. So moving to the third issue that I wanted to talk about, which is Brexit. We've already heard how it's been incredibly helpful to EU unity, and I think that that's absolutely right. The problem with the EU has historically been that the benefits, which are huge, and I'm very much a pro-European, it's quite a remote and complicated organisation. The benefits are quite diffuse. You know, they tend to be macroeconomic. They tend to be about trade. You know, they make us richer because we have more efficient economies, but nobody really falls in love with an efficient economy. But the thing that Brexit does is it really shows what the costs of not having the EU are. And I think that's one of the big reasons why support has risen so strongly in so many countries. We haven't ended up with the domino theory that Brexiteers were talking about in Britain, in 2016, 2017, where several other countries would leave once they saw what a glorious future there was for Britain on the outside. And as we've heard, continental Eurosceptics have abandoned their pledges for EU and Euro membership referendums as a result. But I just want to sort of close this little bit with just some thoughts on Brexit and how Brexiteers have misunderstood really how essentially Brexit is in some ways a kind of boon for the EU. And we're seeing the misunderstanding happen in real time right now, because Johnson and a lot of the strongly pro-Brexit people who are around him have been pushing for no deal. They've been ramping up the rhetoric. I'm sure very soon, perhaps as early as next week, we'll have a lot of money being spent on further no deal preparations. And the reason that they're doing that is that they think that the EU will blink. And the underlying reason for that is that they think that the EU is not strategic. And this is a point that Bridget has made before, so I hope you're not going to make it now, but I'm stealing it from you. But they think the EU isn't strategic. The politics essentially happens in Westminster. And that basically the EU is about Brussels bureaucrats applying rules. That's basically what it is. But I think that that's completely wrong. And the strategy has been very clear from the beginning. And it's a twofold one. One is that the withdrawal agreement, which the UK doesn't like, is the price for having the future relationship which the UK wants. So that sequencing has been absolutely crucial. And it means that if the UK wants to have the economic benefits of a closer relationship, even a free trade agreement with the EU, it has to sign up to the withdrawal agreement. The second part of the strategy is to give the UK a menu of options and not say you can cherry pick. So single market, you've got to have the whole single market and you can't have any votes in the institutions. You can have a customs union, not the single market if you like, but you're not really going to have an independent trade policy, and that's going to be a lot worse economically speaking than the single market. Finally, you can have a free trade agreement, which is a bit worse than a customs union, but you'll get your independent trade policy. However, you will have the most economic costs of any relationship, really, with the EU if you go for that. And the genius of this strategy is that it imposes either economic or political costs on the UK. It can minimise the economic costs and go for single market membership, but it has the political costs of not really having a say over what happens in Europe. Or it can go with an FTA and have lots of economic costs but more political independence. But in either way, the UK loses. And the point of that is not necessarily to punish the UK, it's to make it extremely clear to continental Eurosceptics, the EU's domestic Eurosceptics, what the consequences of a decision to leave the EU will be. Just as an aside, I think that, and I know you must be fed up of Brexit, but I'll just very briefly close on this. My suspicion is that Boris Johnson has boxed himself in so much over no deal with his red line that he must leave on October the 31st by saying in silly comments in an interview that there can be no time limits or renegotiations of the backstop. It's going to be very difficult for him to be able to then turn around, given the fact that the EU is going to be pretty unblinking, and say, actually, guys, we're going to go with a few tweaks and we'll get the deal over the line. So I think that we're likely to see Boris Johnson go for no deal. But I think that that's more likely to lead to a general election before no deal than no deal itself. We've had several moderate Tories just in the last few days making it pretty clear that they're willing to bring down the government if Johnson goes for no deal. So that's the Brexit issue. So thinking about our zero-sum versus win-win versus win-lose kind of thinking. What do we think about the future? The European Parliament elections put together a kind of reshuffling of the centre rather than a big change. We've heard that the Greens and the Liberals did well, and the Socialists and the centre-right a bit less well. That does mean that greenery is going to go up the agenda. But given the fractures that we see within the European system, you've got Poland, which is pretty unhappy at the moment, and which is also a very big coal user. Reducing carbon emissions doesn't come for free. There are always going to be costs involved in that. And generally, the EU has set targets at the EU level, agreed on targets. There's been some big changes in the amount of renewables that are used and so on. But it leaves a lot of the most costly decisions about tax and spending to the member state level because, member states have the legitimacy to be able to say to some people, right, you're going to lose and you're going to gain. And I think that it's going to be difficult for the EU to put together a huge domestic climate package which is going to be transformative. And I think if we look forward to the next 5-10 years, are we really going to see a big step forward in European integration? My suspicion is no. If you look back to, say, 1985 and the Single European Act, which put together the single market, ever since then we've had big new treaties every 5 years, ending in the Lisbon Treaty. We've had one on single market, we've had the euro, we've had enlargement, and then we've had the beginnings of some common security and foreign policies. But I think that the divisions that we see within Europe mean that we're very unlikely to see new treaties for quite a long time, and possibly more than a decade. One, because governments can't agree on what should be in the treaties and what integration is really necessary. And two, because some governments fear that they won't be able to get it past their parliaments or their electorates in referendums. I mean, you guys would have to have a referendum, I think, if we had a new treaty. So that was all a little bit Eeyore-ish, but I just want to finish on a positive note and say that, given the shock to the system that we've had over the last decade, several of these crises have been truly existential. There's a real risk that they could pull the EU apart. Not so much Brexit, but certainly the Eurozone and the migration crisis. And we've ended up with the EU managing to stabilise itself, and I think that that's an enormous achievement, and I'll leave it there.